February 18, 1943. Munich. The University of Munich stands silent in the cold morning air, its stone corridors empty between lectures. Sophie Scholl, 21 years old, walks purposefully through the atrium, a stack of leaflets hidden beneath her winter coat. Her brother Hans walks beside her. They move quickly, dropping papers onto stairwells, placing them on windowsills. The Gestapo expects loyalty from university students, compliance from Germany's educated youth. But in Sophie's hands are words that challenge the Reich itself, printed arguments against the war, moral appeals to conscience. A janitor named Jakob Schmid spots the falling papers. Within minutes, he alerts the authorities. Within hours, Sophie and Hans stand under arrest. The Gestapo's efficiency is legendary, their surveillance absolute. Yet this small student group had already distributed leaflets in 6 German cities. From this moment begins a story that would outlive the Reich itself. Forstenberg, Baden-Württemberg, May 9, 1921. Sophie Magdalena Scholl was born into a Germany still reeling from the Great War's defeat. Her father, Robert Scholl, served as mayor of the small town, a man of liberal principles who valued education and independent thought. Her mother, Magdalena, raised 6 children with devotion to Lutheran faith and ethical living. The Scholl home filled with books, music, and discussions of philosophy and religion. The family's life unfolded against Germany's turbulent years. Hyperinflation devastated savings. Political violence erupted in the streets. The Weimar Republic struggled to maintain order. Young Sophie grew up surrounded by instability, yet her childhood remained marked by warmth and intellectual curiosity. She loved to read, to hike in the forests near her home, to sketch and paint. Her father encouraged critical thinking, teaching his children to question authority rather than accept it blindly. January 30, 1933, brought a seismic shift. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party, which had seemed one faction among many, now controlled the state apparatus. Within months, opposition parties were banned, labor unions dissolved, free press eliminated. The Gleichschaltung, the coordination of all aspects of German life under Nazi ideology, began in earnest. The Scholl family initially showed cautious optimism. Robert Scholl, like many Germans, hoped the new government might restore order and prosperity. The Nazi emphasis on national renewal, on overcoming the humiliation of Versailles, appealed to patriotic sentiment. Sophie's older siblings, Inge, Hans, Elisabeth, Werner, and younger brother, joined Nazi youth organizations along with millions of other young Germans. Sophie herself joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, in 1938 at age 17. The organization offered camaraderie, outdoor activities, a sense of purpose, and belonging. Young Germans were told they were building a new Reich that would last 1,000 years. They learned songs, marched in formations, participated in sports and cultural events. For many, the Hitler Youth provided structure and meaning in an uncertain world. Yet contradictions emerged quickly. Robert Scholl's political conscience could not remain silent. He spoke openly against Nazi policies, criticizing the regime's increasing brutality, its persecution of Jews, its suppression of religious freedom. In May 1937, the Gestapo arrested him for remarks made against Hitler. He served several weeks in prison. The experience shattered any illusions the family might have held. Sophie witnessed her father's courage. She saw how speaking truth brought punishment under totalitarian rule. She began to notice the regime's darker aspects, the disappearance of Jewish neighbors, the mandatory salutes and slogans, the cult of personality surrounding Hitler, the militarization of all social life. Her reading expanded beyond approved texts. She discovered banned authors, forbidden ideas, perspectives that challenged Nazi dogma. By 1939, Sophie's enthusiasm for the BDM had cooled. She observed how the organization indoctrinated rather than educated, how it demanded conformity rather than encouraging independent thought. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the regime's true nature became increasingly apparent. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 1940. Victory followed victory, yet Sophie felt growing unease. The persecution of Jews intensified. New laws stripped away rights, property, dignity. Synagogues burned. People disappeared into concentration camps. The regime spoke of Jews as subhuman, as enemies of the Reich, as targets for elimination. Sophie could not reconcile these actions with any moral principle she had been taught. Her Christian faith emphasized the dignity of every human soul. Nazi ideology preached racial hierarchy and violent domination. By 1941, Sophie had quietly distanced herself from the Hitler Youth. She continued her education, working first as a kindergarten teacher, then preparing to study biology and philosophy at the University of Munich. Her brother Hans, 4 years older, had already begun his university studies before being drafted into military service. His experiences on the Eastern Front profoundly affected him. He witnessed atrocities, saw the brutal reality behind propaganda slogans, returned home deeply troubled. Sophie's path toward active resistance remained unclear, but her internal rejection of Nazism was complete. She had seen how a regime built on lies must sustain itself through violence. She understood that remaining silent meant complicity. Yet she did not yet know what form her opposition might take. The Nazi state appeared invincible in 1941, controlling all media, all institutions, all public space. Dissent brought swift punishment. Resistance seemed futile. Nevertheless, seeds had been planted. Sophie's conscience, shaped by family values and Christian teaching, could not accept totalitarian evil. Her intellectual development, encouraged by her father's example, gave her tools to analyze and reject Nazi ideology. Her personal experiences, watching her father's arrest, witnessing persecution, seeing through propaganda, prepared her for the choice she would soon face. By spring 1942, when Sophie moved to Munich to begin university studies, she carried with her both moral conviction and awareness of terrible risk. The city would become the stage for her transformation from private dissenter to public resistor. The University of Munich would bring her into contact with others who shared her rejection of Nazi rule. Together, they would form the White Rose, a name that would become synonymous with moral courage in the face of overwhelming power. Munich, May 1942. The Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich stood as one of Germany's oldest and most prestigious institutions. Its halls had witnessed centuries of scholarship, philosophical debate, scientific discovery. Now, under the Third Reich, the university served the state. Professors taught Nazi-approved curriculum. Students were expected to demonstrate political loyalty. The Gestapo maintained active surveillance of faculty and students alike. Yet spaces for dissent still existed, hidden in careful conversations, disguised as academic discussions. Sophie Scholl arrived at the university in spring 1942 to study biology and philosophy. She reunited with her brother Hans, who had returned from military service on the Eastern Front to continue his medical studies. Hans introduced her to a small circle of friends who shared their disillusionment with the regime. Alexander Schmerel, Hans's closest friend, was a medical student of Russian-German heritage. Born in Orenburg, Russia, he brought a bicultural perspective and deep hatred of Nazi racial ideology. Christoph Probst, another medical student, came from a liberal family and possessed a gentle, thoughtful nature. Willy Graf, Catholic and serious-minded, had witnessed Nazi brutality firsthand during military service in Yugoslavia. These young men, along with Professor Kurt Huber, a philosophy and musicology professor known for his intellectual integrity, formed the core of what would become the White Rose. Their initial gatherings seemed innocuous, students discussing literature, philosophy, theology. They read banned authors, Thomas Mann, whose books were burned by the Nazis. They studied Christian existentialists, philosophers who emphasized individual conscience over state authority. They listened to music the regime condemned as degenerate. These private acts of cultural resistance gradually evolved toward more direct action. The catalyst came from Hans's experiences on the Eastern Front. During summer 1942, he and Schmerel served with a medical company in Russia. They witnessed mass executions of Jews. They saw prisoners of war shot for minor infractions. They observed the systematic brutality of German occupation. The propaganda about defending European civilization from Bolshevism dissolved in the face of witnessed atrocities. Hans returned to Munich convinced that silence meant complicity in mass murder. Hans and Schmerel began writing. They crafted arguments against the war, against Nazi ideology, against the collective guilt Germans were accumulating through passive acceptance of evil. Their writing drew on Christian teaching, German philosophical tradition, and simple moral outrage. They cited statistics about murdered Jews, described witnessed atrocities, appealed to their readers' conscience and reason. The question became how to distribute these ideas. Public speech was impossible. Any open opposition brought immediate arrest. Publishing through official channels was unthinkable. The regime controlled all media absolutely. The group decided on leaflets, simple printed documents that could be mailed anonymously or left in public places. The method was old-fashioned, almost quaint, yet it represented one of the few available means of communication outside state control. They needed a name. After discussions, they settled on the White Rose. The exact origin remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest Hans was inspired by a Spanish novel, La Rosa Blanca, about resistance to tyranny. Others point to the White Rose's symbolism of purity and innocence in German Romantic literature. Regardless of origin, the name evoked beauty, hope, and moral clarity. Everything the regime opposed. In late June 1942, the first leaflet appeared. Printed on a hand-cranked duplicating machine, it bore the heading, Leaflets of the White Rose. The text opened with a direct appeal. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct. The leaflet cited specific figures of murdered Jews, described Nazi crimes, called for passive resistance against the state. The group produced between 100 and 100 copies of the first leaflet. They mailed them to carefully selected addresses, intellectuals, professors, physicians, business people, anyone who might be receptive to their message. They chose recipients from telephone books of Munich and nearby cities, hoping to reach educated Germans who retained capacity for independent thought. The Gestapo, despite its vast surveillance apparatus, could not monitor every mailbox in Germany. The response remained unknown. Anonymous distribution meant no feedback loop. The group could only hope their words reached receptive minds, planted seeds of doubt, encouraged others to resist. They proceeded to write a second leaflet, then a third, then a fourth. Each refined, their arguments sharpened their moral appeals, cited additional evidence of Nazi crimes. Professor Kurt Huber, though not yet directly involved in leaflet production, provided intellectual guidance. His lectures on philosophy and ethics, carefully worded to avoid Gestapo attention, nevertheless communicated opposition to totalitarian thought. He emphasized the dignity of the individual conscience, the importance of moral law above state law, the philosopher's duty to speak truth regardless of political consequences. His influence shaped the group's intellectual foundation. Sophie's role in the White Rose evolved gradually. Initially, she knew of the group's activities but did not participate directly. Hans tried to protect her from the extreme dangers such work entailed. Possession of anti-Nazi materials meant death. Distribution of subversive leaflets guaranteed execution. Yet Sophie insisted on joining fully. She argued that women bore equal responsibility for opposing evil, that her conscience demanded action, that protection meant complicity in silence. By late summer 1942, Sophie had become an active member. She helped purchase paper and envelopes, prepared leaflets for mailing, served as lookout during printing sessions. She contributed ideas for future leaflets, suggested distribution strategies, recruited her friend Trottle LaFrenz, another student who shared their convictions. The group remained small, fewer than a dozen core members, but their impact would exceed their numbers. The fourth leaflet, distributed in July 1942, concluded with words that captured their mission. "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." This defiant declaration embodied their purpose. They could not overthrow the regime through force. They possessed no army, no weapons, no political organization. Their power lay in words, in moral argument, in the stubborn insistence that truth mattered, even when speaking it meant death. The autumn and winter of 1942 marked the White Rose's most productive period. The group expanded their operations, refined their tactics, extended their reach. Between June and July 1942, they produced 4 leaflets, mailed to addresses across southern Germany. The content grew bolder with each iteration. Early leaflets appealed to passive resistance and moral awakening. Later ones called explicitly for sabotage of the war effort, for overthrow of the Nazi state. The military situation influenced their urgency. In August 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad began. German forces pushed deep into the Soviet city, becoming locked in brutal house-to-house combat. By November, Soviet forces had surrounded the German Sixth Army. The Wehrmacht, previously thought invincible, faced potential catastrophe. The White Rose recognized this as a turning point, a moment when German public opinion might prove receptive to anti-war messages. Hans and Schmorell resumed military service in Russia during this period, serving again with a medical company. They returned in November 1942, even more convinced of Nazi Germany's moral bankruptcy and inevitable military defeat. They had witnessed mass graves, burned villages, the systematic destruction of everything in the Wehrmacht's path. They knew the regime was guilty of crimes that no military victory could justify or erase. Upon their return to Munich, the White Rose resumed operations with renewed intensity. They drafted a 5th leaflet, then a 6th. These documents abandoned earlier caution. The 6th leaflet, titled Fellow Students, addressed university students directly, calling on them to recognize that the war was lost, that further fighting meant only additional suffering, that the time had come for Germans to overthrow their government. The distribution method evolved. Mailing leaflets provided some protection through anonymity, but reached limited audiences. The group decided on direct distribution at universities. In January and February 1943, members traveled to nearby university cities: Stuttgart, Vienna, Salzburg, Linz, Augsburg, leaving stacks of leaflets in lecture halls and corridors. They painted anti-Nazi slogans on buildings: "Down with Hitler," "Freedom," "Hitler mass murderer." These actions brought their message to thousands of students. Sophie participated fully in these operations. She carried leaflets in suitcases, distributed them during night journeys, painted slogans on Munich buildings. She understood the risk. Discovery meant arrest, torture, execution. Yet she believed silence was a greater evil than death. Her diary from this period reveals her state of mind. What we wrote and said is believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did. The Gestapo took notice. Reports of subversive leaflets prompted investigations. The writing style, the distribution patterns, the sophistication of arguments suggested educated perpetrators, possibly students. Surveillance increased at universities. Rewards were offered for information. The net was tightening, yet the White Rose continued their work. February 18, 1943, arrived cold and gray. Classes at the University of Munich proceeded normally. Students moved between lectures, the routine of academic life continuing despite the war. Sophie and Hans Scholl arrived at the university carrying a suitcase filled with copies of the 6th leaflet. They had distributed many during the night, leaving stacks in empty corridors. Now, in daylight, they moved quickly through the building, placing final copies. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, they climbed to the upper floor of the university's main atrium. The corridor stood empty, students still in lectures. Hans and Sophie worked efficiently, placing leaflets on windowsills, tucking them into doorframes. As they prepared to leave, Sophie noticed they still had approximately 100 leaflets remaining. In a spontaneous decision that would prove fatal, she climbed onto a balustrade overlooking the atrium and scattered the leaflets into the air below. The white papers fluttered down like snow, spreading across the marble floor. Students emerging from lectures looked up in surprise. Among them was Jakob Schmid, a maintenance man and Nazi Party member. He immediately recognized the leaflets as subversive material. He saw Sophie standing on the balustrade, Hans beside her. Without hesitation, Schmid blocked the exit and summoned university administrators. Within minutes, Robert Moore, a Gestapo interrogator, arrived at the scene. Sophie and Hans were detained, their suitcase searched, additional leaflets discovered. They were transported to Gestapo headquarters at Wittelsbacher Palace. Other members of the White Rose, unaware of the arrest, continued their normal routines. The Gestapo moved swiftly to identify and apprehend accomplices. The efficiency of the Nazi security apparatus became immediately apparent. Within hours, Christoph Probst was arrested at his military post. Interrogators extracted names through relentless questioning, threats against family members, promises of leniency in exchange for cooperation. Hans initially tried to protect others, claiming sole responsibility. Sophie likewise insisted she acted alone. These attempts proved futile. The Gestapo had been investigating the White Rose for months. They possessed handwriting samples, postmark patterns, witness statements from cities where leaflets had appeared. Hans's and Sophie's apartment was searched, revealing the duplicating machine, paper supplies, drafts of leaflets. The evidence was overwhelming. Within days, Alexander Schmerel went into hiding. Willy Graf was arrested. Professor Kurt Huber came under investigation. The speed of events shocked even the perpetrators. On February 18th, Sophie and Hans walked free citizens. By evening, they sat in Gestapo cells. By February 19th, they had been interrogated for hours, their network partially exposed. By February 20th, the Reich Minister of Justice had been informed, and orders came from Berlin. The case must be processed immediately. Exemplary punishment must be delivered to deter other students from resistance. Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court and one of Nazi Germany's most feared judges, traveled personally to Munich to preside over the trial. His reputation preceded him: screaming denunciations, predetermined guilty verdicts, enthusiastic application of the death penalty. No defendant brought before Freisler's court could expect mercy. His courtroom was theater, designed to humiliate and destroy, to demonstrate the state's absolute power over individual life. February 22, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst faced trial. The speed violated all. Pretense of legal process. Defense attorneys had minimal time to prepare. Defendants could not mount substantive defense. The outcome was predetermined before the trial began. The moment marked a critical juncture. Sophie Scholl, 21 years old, stood accused of high treason against the German Reich. The penalty was death. The White Rose, which had operated in secret for 8 months, now faced public exposure and destruction. Yet the very act of prosecution would ultimately serve the group's purpose, ensuring their message reached far beyond anything their leaflets had achieved. The People's Court convened at 10 o'clock on the morning of February 22, 1943, in Munich's Palace of Justice. Roland Freisler presided, flanked by Nazi Party officials serving as associate judges. The courtroom filled with spectators, university officials, Nazi Party members, Gestapo officers. Robert and Magdalena Scholl, Sophie and Hans's parents, were permitted to attend, though they had learned of the trial only hours before. The proceedings began with the reading of charges. Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst stood accused of high treason, undermining military morale, aiding the enemy, and defeatist propaganda. The evidence was presented systematically: the seized leaflets, the duplicating machine found in their apartment, witness testimony from Jakob Schmid, forensic analysis of handwriting, postal records showing the pattern of mailed leaflets across German cities. Freisler's conduct during the trial demonstrated the true nature of Nazi justice. He screamed accusations, interrupted defendants, hurled insults. He called them traitors, cowards, enemies of the German people. He mocked their education, suggesting that universities bred disloyalty and defeatism. His performance was designed to humiliate, to demonstrate that resistance was not only criminal but contemptible. Yet Sophie Scholl refused to be cowed. When Freisler demanded to know how she could betray Germany during wartime, Sophie responded calmly. Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did. Her composure in the face of Freisler's rage struck observers. Here was a young woman facing certain death, yet she spoke with conviction and dignity. Hans likewise defended their actions. When accused of stabbing Germany in the back while soldiers fought on the front, he replied, "What we said and wrote is what many people are thinking. They just don't dare to say it out loud." Christoph Probst, arrested with an unfinished leaflet in his possession, had less opportunity for defense, yet he too maintained his moral stance. The defense attorneys, appointed only days before, could do nothing substantive. The law under Nazi Germany permitted no real defense against political charges. The trial was formality, the verdict foreordained. At one point, Robert Scholl stood up in the courtroom and shouted that he should be on trial too, that his children learned their values from him. Guards forcibly removed him from the courtroom. The trial lasted less than 4 hours. By early afternoon, Freisler pronounced judgment, guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by guillotine, to be carried out immediately. No appeal, no clemency, no delay. The speed was deliberate, designed to prevent any public sympathy from developing, to eliminate the defendants before their courage could inspire others. Sophie's reaction to the death sentence revealed her character. Witnesses reported that she showed no visible emotion, no fear or despair. She had accepted the possibility of death when she chose resistance. Her Christian faith provided comfort. She believed death was not the end, that moral truth transcended temporal power. She spent her final hours writing letters to family members, expressing love and asking forgiveness for the pain her choices would cause them. The prison chaplain who visited Sophie in her cell reported that she remained calm and at peace. She spoke of her conviction that their actions were necessary, that remaining silent in the face of evil would have been a greater betrayal than the betrayal for which she was condemned. She expressed no regret about the leaflets, only sorrow for the suffering her execution would cause her parents. Hans showed similar courage. He told the chaplain that their actions might seem futile now, but that history would judge them differently than the Nazi court did. He believed that speaking truth mattered regardless of immediate consequences, that moral witness had value even in defeat. He wrote to his family expressing love and asking them to remain strong. Christoph Probst, who had 3 young children, struggled most with the impending execution. He had been arrested with a draft of a leaflet, though he had not participated in distribution. His wife had recently died, leaving his children orphaned. Yet even Probst maintained his dignity, converting to Catholicism in his final hours, seeking spiritual comfort as physical hope vanished. The afternoon of February 22nd passed quickly. At 5 o'clock, approximately 7 hours after the trial concluded, prison guards came for the condemned. Sophie was led from her cell first. She walked calmly, showing no resistance. As she passed her brother's cell, she called out farewell. Hans responded with love and encouragement. The execution chamber at Stadelheim prison housed a guillotine, the preferred method of execution in Nazi Germany. The apparatus was efficient and brutal, a heavy blade falling to sever the neck, death instantaneous. Hans was executed first. Christoph Probst followed. Sophie Scholl was led to the guillotine last. Witnesses reported Sophie's final words. As guards prepared to position her beneath the blade, she said quietly, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But how many have to die on the battlefield in these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted? Among the student body, there will certainly be a revolt." Then, moments later, her last recorded words, "God, you are my refuge unto everlasting." The blade fell at 5:17 in the afternoon. Sophie Scholl died instantly. She was 21 years old. From arrest to execution, exactly 96 hours had elapsed. The Nazi regime had demonstrated its power to destroy opposition swiftly and absolutely. Yet, in their haste to eliminate the White Rose, the authorities had also created martyrs whose witness would outlast the Third Reich itself. News of the executions spread quickly, despite official attempts at suppression. University students learned of the deaths. The Scholl family received official notification. Other White Rose members, still at large, heard the news with horror and renewed determination. The Gestapo continued its investigation, seeking to arrest everyone connected with the resistance group. More trials would follow, more death sentences would be pronounced. But the first blow had been struck, and the White Rose's blood testimony had begun. The 6 leaflets produced by the White Rose between June 1942 and February 1943 represent extraordinary documents in the history of resistance to tyranny. Each leaflet reflected careful thought, moral conviction, and sophisticated understanding of philosophy, theology, and politics. These were not crude propaganda, but reasoned arguments appealing to conscience and intellect. The first leaflet, distributed in late June 1942, opened with a philosophical argument against tyranny. It quoted extensively from Friedrich Schiller, Goethe, and Aristotle, establishing an intellectual foundation. It then pivoted to specific accusations. Since the conquest of Poland, 300,000 Jews have been murdered in that country in the most bestial manner. This figure, while lower than the actual toll, represented specific knowledge that contradicted official propaganda. The leaflet called for passive resistance. Offer passive resistance wherever you may be. Forestall the spread of this atheistic war machine before it is too late. It defined passive resistance specifically, refusing to contribute to war-related collections, boycotting Nazi-controlled theaters and concerts, withdrawing from Nazi organizations. These were small acts, yet the leaflet argued that collective small acts could undermine the regime's social control. The second leaflet, mailed in early July 1942, intensified the rhetoric. It addressed the systematic murder of Jews directly. Here we see the most terrible crime committed against the dignity of man, a crime that has no counterpart in human history. It cited specific numbers. 300,000 Polish Jews murdered, the entire Jewish population of Poland, estimated at millions, facing annihilation. These statistics came from illegal sources, foreign radio broadcasts, underground newspapers, reports from soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. Possessing such information was itself criminal. Distributing it meant death. Yet the White Rose believed Germans needed to know the truth, that ignorance could not excuse complicity, that citizens bore responsibility for their government's crimes. The third leaflet, distributed in mid-July 1942, adopted a more urgent tone. It described Nazi Germany as a criminal state. Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war, and when he blasphemously uses the name of the Almighty, he means the power of evil, the fallen angel, Satan. This was treasonous speech, yet it expressed what the White Rose believed to be simple truth. The leaflet concluded with a call to action. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace. This declaration of purpose captured their mission. They could not overthrow the regime through violence. They possessed no political organization, no military force. Their weapon was truth, their strategy was moral witness, their hope was that awakened conscience might lead to collective resistance. The fourth leaflet appeared in late July 1942, just before Hans and Schmorell departed for military service in Russia. It contained the most sophisticated theological and philosophical argumentation. Drawing on St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and contemporary Christian existentialists, it argued that natural law superseded state law, that individuals bore moral responsibility to resist unjust authority, that obedience to evil commands was itself evil. After Hans and Schmorell returned from Russia in November 1942, the White Rose produced two final leaflets. The fifth, mailed in January 1943, reflected their direct witness of atrocities. It described mass executions of Jews in precise, horrifying detail. It named Polish towns where massacres occurred. It provided statistics. 350,000 Jews have been killed in Poland alone since the occupation. Again, the actual number was far higher, but the figure cited represented documented deaths. The sixth and final leaflet, titled Fellow Students, was distributed in February 1943, just before the arrests. It addressed university students directly, calling on them to recognize Germany's inevitable military defeat and to prepare for post-Nazi reconstruction. It cited the disaster at Stalingrad, where in early February 1943, the German Sixth Army had finally surrendered after months of encirclement. The day of reckoning has come, the leaflet declared, the reckoning of German youth with the most abominable tyrant our people have ever been forced to endure. It called for student demonstrations, for open resistance, for Germans to separate themselves from Nazi criminality before defeat made redemption impossible. This was the leaflet Sophie and Hans were distributing when Jakob Schmid spotted them. The impact of these leaflets is difficult to measure precisely. The White Rose distributed thousands of copies across southern Germany and Austria. Many recipients destroyed them immediately, fearing possession would bring Gestapo attention. Others read them privately, sharing contents cautiously with trusted friends. A few were moved to their own small acts of resistance, refusing to give the Hitler salute, listening to forbidden radio broadcasts, making critical remarks about the regime. The Gestapo took the leaflet seriously enough to mount major investigations. Resources were diverted to identify the perpetrators. When arrests occurred, trials were expedited and death sentences imposed immediately. This response indicated that the regime recognized the threat posed by intellectual resistance, by moral arguments that challenged the foundations of Nazi ideology. More significantly, the leaflets reached beyond their immediate recipients. In July 1943, after the White Rose members had been executed, Allied aircraft dropped millions of copies of the sixth leaflet over Germany. Retitled The Manifesto of the Students of Munich, the leaflet was translated and distributed worldwide. The White Rose's words, which reached perhaps 10,000 Germans through clandestine distribution, ultimately reached millions through Allied psychological warfare. The content of the leaflets demonstrated that resistance to Nazism existed within Germany itself, that not all Germans accepted Hitler, that moral opposition persisted despite totalitarian control. This countered Nazi propaganda claims of national unity and Allied assumptions about German collective guilt. The White Rose showed that even in the heart of Hitler's Reich, conscience could not be completely suppressed. The philosophical sophistication of the leaflets also challenged assumptions about resistance. These were not crude political pamphlets, but carefully reasoned arguments grounded in Germany's own intellectual tradition. The White Rose appealed to Schiller and Goethe, to Christian theology, to natural law philosophy. Traditions the Nazis claimed to represent but actually betrayed. This intellectual resistance proved that Nazi ideology was shallow, that it could not withstand serious philosophical scrutiny, that educated Germans who thought critically would reject it. The execution of Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst on February 22, 1943, did not end the Gestapo's investigation. If anything, the arrests accelerated the hunt for accomplices. The Reich Security Main Office in Berlin demanded that every person connected with the White Rose be identified, arrested, and prosecuted. The regime viewed the student resistance as particularly dangerous because it demonstrated that even educated, privileged Germans could reject National Socialism. Robert Moore, the Gestapo interrogator who had questioned Sophie and Hans, continued extracting information from documents and witnesses. The seized duplicating machine provided fingerprints. Handwriting analysis connected additional individuals to leaflet drafts. Postal records showed mailing patterns. Witnesses at the university identified students who associated with the Scholls. The investigative machinery of the Nazi security state operated with ruthless efficiency. Alexander Schmerel, co-founder of the White Rose, went into hiding immediately after learning of the arrests. He changed apartments frequently, relied on trusted friends, avoided public places. For nearly 2 weeks he evaded capture. Then, on February 24, 1943, an air raid shelter warden recognized him and alerted authorities. Schmerel was arrested without resistance. He knew what fate awaited him. Willy Graf was arrested on February 18th, the same day as Sophie and Hans, though several hours later. The Gestapo had identified him through documents found in the Scholls' apartment. Graf endured months of interrogation, during which the Gestapo attempted to extract names of everyone he had contacted about resistance. Graf revealed little, protecting his network even under torture. His interrogations continued until October 1943, demonstrating both Gestapo persistence and Graf's courage. Professor Kurt Huber came under immediate suspicion. His lectures had inspired White Rose members. His apartment was searched on February 26th, revealing drafts of the 6th leaflet in his handwriting. Huber made no attempt to flee or deny involvement. When arrested, he told interrogators, "I intended to bring about a change in German intellectual life through my teaching activities." He refused to recant his opposition to Nazi ideology. Traute Lafrenz, Sophie's friend and fellow student, was arrested in March 1943. She had distributed leaflets and recruited others to the cause. During interrogation, she maintained composure and revealed minimal information, protecting other members of the resistance network. Her courage under questioning impressed even her interrogators, though it did not save her from prosecution. The Gestapo cast their net widely. Hans Herzl and his sister Suzanne, school friends of Sophie from Ulm, were arrested for distributing leaflets in their hometown. Jürgen Grimminger, a businessman who had provided financial support to the White Rose, was detained. Katharina Schudekopf, who had helped copy leaflets, faced arrest. Each arrest led to further interrogations, more names, expanding circles of investigation. The scale of the Gestapo operation revealed how seriously the regime took intellectual resistance. Hundreds of man-hours were devoted to investigating every connection, however tenuous. Files were compiled on individuals who had merely received leaflets. University students faced questioning if they had attended lectures by Professor Huber or associated with known White Rose members. The message was clear. Any connection to resistance, even passive knowledge of it, could bring severe consequences. Yet the Gestapo's very thoroughness also demonstrated the regime's vulnerability. Despite controlling all media, all institutions, all public spaces, the Nazi state remained deeply insecure. A handful of students with a duplicating machine had prompted massive investigation. Simple moral arguments printed on cheap paper had required immediate, violent suppression. The disproportion between threat and response suggested weakness rather than strength. A second trial was scheduled for April 19, 1943. Roland Freisler again presided. Alexander Schmorell, Professor Kurt Huber, and Willy Graf faced charges identical to those that had condemned the Scholls: high treason and aiding the enemy. The trial followed the same pattern as the first: predetermined verdict, screaming denunciations, no meaningful defense permitted. Schmorell maintained his defiance. When Freisler accused him of betraying Germany, Schmorell replied that he considered himself Russian as well as German, that he opposed the war against Russia, that he could not remain silent while his mother's homeland was destroyed. This answer enraged Freisler, who interpreted bicultural identity as evidence of disloyalty. Schmorell was sentenced to death. Professor Huber delivered a final statement that became one of the most powerful documents of German resistance. He spoke calmly, with professorial precision, explaining why conscience demanded opposition to the regime. "I wanted to awaken student youth to stand up for the simple fundamentals of the true state and of intellectual freedom," he said. His eloquence made no difference to the verdict. Death by guillotine. Willy Graf also received a death sentence, though his execution was delayed. The Gestapo continued interrogating him, hoping to extract additional names. Graf endured months of questioning, maintaining silence about his contacts. Finally, on October 12, 1943, he was executed, having protected his network to the end. Additional trials followed through the summer of 1943. Hans Hirzel and Franz Müller received sentences of 5 years imprisonment. Susanna Hirzel received 6 months. Jürgen Grimminger received 10 years. Traute Lafrenz received 1 year, though she was later rearrested and sent to a concentration camp. The sentences varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Anyone connected with the White Rose faced severe punishment. The Gestapo investigations also extended beyond Munich. In Hamburg, another resistance group inspired by the White Rose had formed. Led by Heinz Kucharski, this group distributed their own leaflets and maintained contact with Munich. The Gestapo arrested Kucharski and approximately 30 others. 8 were executed. The Hamburg branch demonstrated that the White Rose had succeeded in inspiring exactly what the Nazis most feared: copycat resistance in other cities. By late 1943, the Gestapo considered the White Rose investigation complete. Approximately 80 people had been arrested in connection with the group. 13 received death sentences and were executed. Many others served prison terms or were sent to concentration camps. The network had been destroyed, its members killed or imprisoned, its distribution apparatus dismantled. Yet the Gestapo's victory proved hollow. The executions created martyrs. The trials, though intended to demonstrate state power, instead revealed the moral courage of the condemned. News of the White Rose spread through underground networks, whispered conversations, illegal radio broadcasts. The regime had silenced the voices, but could not erase the message. In attempting to destroy the White Rose, the Nazis ensured its immortality. The final hours of Sophie Scholl's life on February 22, 1943, revealed the character that had led her to resistance. From the moment of her arrest at noon on February 18th to her execution at 5:17 that afternoon, Sophie demonstrated remarkable composure, courage, and clarity of purpose. Her conduct during this period transformed her from an active resistor into an enduring symbol of moral witness. The Gestapo interrogation began immediately after arrest. Robert Moore, the investigating officer, was an experienced interrogator known for his ability to extract confessions. He employed standard techniques, alternating between aggression and false sympathy, threatening family members, promising leniency in exchange for cooperation, presenting evidence to demonstrate the futility of denial. Sophie initially attempted to protect others. She claimed sole responsibility for the leaflets, insisted her brother had minimal involvement, denied knowledge of other resistance members. These attempts lasted only hours. The evidence was overwhelming: the duplicating machine in their apartment, drafts in Hans's handwriting, testimony from Jakob Schmid, postal records. By the evening of February 18th, both Sophie and Hans had admitted their roles in the White Rose. Yet, even in confession, Sophie maintained moral clarity. She did not apologize or express regret for the leaflet's content. When Moore asked how she could betray Germany during wartime, Sophie replied simply, "What we did will cause waves. Many people inwardly agree with what we wrote, they just lack the courage to express it." She believed their actions were not betrayal, but loyalty to higher principles than the state demanded. The prison chaplain, Father Heinrich Speer, visited Sophie in her cell during her final days. He later recorded their conversations. Sophie spoke of her Christian faith, her belief that death was not the end, her conviction that moral truth transcended temporal punishment. She asked about theological questions, the nature of sacrifice, the meaning of martyrdom, whether deliberately choosing death for principle constituted suicide. Father Speer provided what comfort he could, though he knew Sophie's fate was sealed. Sophie wrote letters to family members during her imprisonment. To her parents, she expressed love and asked forgiveness for the pain her actions would cause. To her siblings, she urged them to remain strong in their convictions. To friends, she affirmed her belief that the White Rose's witness mattered regardless of immediate consequences. These letters, smuggled from prison, provided final testimony to her state of mind, sorrowful for the suffering she caused loved ones, yet at peace with her choices. The trial on February 22nd lasted only hours. The verdict was predetermined. When Freisler pronounced the death sentence, Sophie showed no visible reaction. Witnesses reported that she remained calm, almost serene. She had accepted this possibility when she chose resistance. Fear no longer governed her. The brief time between sentencing and execution, approximately 3 hours, followed Nazi protocol for political prisoners. No appeals were permitted, no delays granted. The regime wanted swift elimination of resistors, both to prevent public sympathy and to demonstrate state power. Sophie used these hours to finalize her letters and receive a last visit from her parents. Robert and Magdalena Scholl were permitted a final meeting with their children. The encounter lasted only minutes, conducted under guard supervision. No physical contact was allowed. Sophie assured her parents that she had no regrets, that her conscience was clear, that they should not grieve for her choices. Robert Scholl told his children he was proud of them. Magdalena embraced each child as guards permitted, knowing she would never see them again. Sophie's last recorded words came as guards led her to the execution chamber. It was late afternoon, sunlight still visible through high prison windows. Sophie looked toward the light and said, "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go." Then, reflecting on the war's carnage, she added, "But how many have to die on the battlefield in these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted?" These words captured Sophie's perspective. She did not see herself as a victim, but as a witness. Her death, she believed, had purpose: to awaken German conscience, to demonstrate that resistance was possible, to preserve moral witness against totalitarian claims of absolute loyalty. She accepted death as the cost of maintaining integrity in an age of collective evil. As guards positioned her beneath the guillotine blade, Sophie spoke her final words. "God, you are my refuge unto everlasting." The execution was immediate. She died instantly, without suffering. Hans was executed moments before her, Christoph Probst moments after. By 5:30 that afternoon, all three were dead. Their bodies were released to families for burial. Small funerals were held, attended only by immediate family under Gestapo surveillance. News of the executions spread despite official attempts at suppression. University students learned details through whispered conversations. The Scholl family received official notification, though they already knew. Other White Rose members, still free, heard the news with horror and renewed determination. The speed of the executions, 96 hours from arrest to death, shocked even those familiar with Nazi brutality. The impact on remaining White Rose members was profound. Alexander Schmorell, in hiding, learned that his closest friends had been executed. He knew his own arrest was inevitable, yet he continued to plan resistance activities until his capture. Willy Graf, already under arrest, steeled himself for interrogation, determined to protect others even under torture. Professor Huber, knowing investigation had reached him, prepared for trial rather than fleeing. The executions also affected the broader student community. Some students were cowed into silence, fearing association with resistance would bring similar punishment. Others were inspired by the courage of the condemned. Small acts of defiance increased. Unsigned anti-Nazi graffiti appeared on university buildings. Anonymous leaflets circulated. Students silently refused the Hitler salute. The regime had eliminated the White Rose's core members, but could not eliminate the questions their witness raised. Sophie's particular impact stemmed partly from her gender and age. Nazi propaganda idealized women as mothers and homemakers, apolitical supporters of the regime. Sophie contradicted this image completely. She was educated, politically engaged, willing to die for principles. Her courage challenged assumptions about women's roles, about youth's supposed malleability, about the regime's claims to universal support. A 21-year-old woman had faced death with more dignity than the screaming judge who condemned her. The execution chamber at Stadelheim prison, where Sophie died, would witness many more deaths before the war ended. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, concentration camp survivors accused of sabotage, all faced the guillotine in that same room. Yet Sophie's death retained special significance. She had walked calmly to execution, refused to beg for mercy, maintained moral witness to the end. In a regime built on violence and fear, such courage represented the ultimate rebellion. The immediate aftermath of the White Rose executions seemed to confirm Nazi power. The resistance group was destroyed, its members dead or imprisoned, its distribution network dismantled. The Gestapo declared the case closed. University administrators issued warnings against political activity. Students returned to their studies under increased surveillance. The regime appeared to have eliminated the threat completely. Yet even as the executions proceeded, the White Rose's influence began spreading beyond Nazi control. In July 1943, just 5 months after Sophie's death, Allied aircraft dropped millions of copies of the 6th White Rose leaflet over Germany. British intelligence had obtained the text through underground networks. They retitled it The Manifesto of the Students of Munich and used it in psychological warfare operations. German civilians picking up these leaflets from the streets learned that resistance existed within their own country. Nazi propaganda had insisted on absolute national unity, universal support for the war effort, no opposition except from foreign enemies. The White Rose leaflets proved these claims false. Germans themselves, educated university students, had condemned the regime and called for its overthrow. This revelation had profound psychological impact. The leaflets also reached Allied audiences. Newspapers in Britain and the United States published accounts of the White Rose trials and executions. American journalists wrote about Sophie Scholl's courage, drawing parallels to national heroes in their own traditions. The image of young Germans resisting Hitler challenged simplistic narratives about German collective guilt, showing that moral opposition persisted even under totalitarian control. Thomas Mann, the exiled German novelist and Nobel laureate, learned of the White Rose through Allied intelligence reports. On June 27, 1943, he delivered a radio address broadcast into Germany by the BBC. Mann spoke directly about the executions. "Brave, magnificent young people, you shall not have died in vain. You shall not be forgotten. The German people will honor you when they have recovered from their present shameful blindness, and they will recover from it sooner than the whole world imagines." Mann's words proved prophetic, though the recovery took longer than he hoped. During the war's final years, from 1943 to 1945, the White Rose remained known primarily through underground networks and Allied propaganda. The Nazi regime suppressed all mention of the group within Germany. Speaking about the White Rose meant risking Gestapo investigation. The names Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and their companions could not be mentioned in public discourse. The war's end in May 1945 changed everything. As Allied forces occupied Germany, as concentration camps were liberated, as the full extent of Nazi crimes became visible, Germans began the painful process of confronting their recent past. The White Rose emerged as a symbol of the other Germany, the Germans who had resisted, who had maintained moral witness, who had opposed Hitler even unto death. In Munich, where the White Rose had operated, memorials appeared quickly. The university renamed its main plaza, a Geschwister-Scholl-Platz, Scholl Sibling Square, in 1946. Bronze plaques marked the location where Sophie and Hans had distributed leaflets. The execution chamber at Stadelheim prison became a memorial site. Streets throughout Munich received names honoring White Rose members. The process of commemoration accelerated through the 1950s and 60s. Books about the White Rose appeared based on surviving documents and witness testimony. The most influential was Inga Scholl's memoir, Die Weiße Rose, published in 1952. Inga, Sophie, and Hans's older sister compiled documents, leaflets, letters, and testimonies to create a comprehensive account. Her book introduced the White Rose to a new generation of Germans growing up in the post-war period. Educational institutions embraced the White Rose as a teaching tool. Schools throughout Germany incorporated White Rose history into their curricula. Students learned about moral courage, about individual responsibility under dictatorship, about the importance of resistance to injustice. The White Rose became central to Germany's effort to teach democratic values and prevent future totalitarianism. The 1968 student movement in Germany drew explicit inspiration from the White Rose. Young Germans protesting against their parents' generation's complicity in Nazism held up Sophie Scholl and her companions as models of youthful resistance. The White Rose demonstrated that students could play meaningful roles in opposing injustice, that moral witness from young people mattered, that one need not wait for adulthood to take principled stands. Statues and monuments proliferated. In Munich's Hofgarten, a memorial to the White Rose was erected, featuring the group's members in bronze. In Forstenberg, Sophie's birthplace, a memorial center opened. In cities across Germany, schools and streets were named for White Rose members. The German Postal Service issued commemorative stamps. The German government established the Weiss Rose Foundation to preserve documents and promote research. The Catholic Church beatified several White Rose members. The process began in the 1990s as the Church recognized their resistance as Christian witness. While formal beatification faced complications, martyrdom must be explicitly for faith, not politics. The Church honored their memory through special masses and recognitions. Protestant churches likewise commemorated White Rose members as examples of faithful witness under persecution. international recognition followed. The White Rose became known worldwide as a symbol of resistance to tyranny. Their leaflets were translated into dozens of languages. Scholars from many countries studied the group's history, tactics, and impact. Comparisons were drawn to resistance movements in other totalitarian states, showing common patterns of moral courage under repression. Yet perhaps the most significant legacy was personal, rather than institutional. Millions of individual Germans, especially young people, found in Sophie Scholl a role model for moral courage. Her diary entries, published posthumously, revealed a thoughtful young woman struggling with difficult choices, ultimately choosing principle over safety. Her ordinariness made her extraordinary. She was not a professional revolutionary or trained resistance fighter, just a student who could not remain silent in the face of evil. The White Rose also provided comfort to survivors of Nazi persecution. For Jews, for political prisoners, for all those who suffered under the regime, knowledge that some Germans had resisted offered partial redemption. Not all Germans were complicit. Some had opposed at great cost. This knowledge did not erase suffering or excuse collective failures, but it complicated simplistic narratives and preserved hope for human decency even under the worst conditions. 70 years after Sophie Scholl's execution, her legacy remains vital in Germany and beyond. The White Rose endures not as historical curiosity, but as living symbol of moral resistance. Schools, foundations, memorials, and annual commemorations keep their witness alive. Yet the true measure of their impact lies not in monuments, but in minds, in the countless individuals inspired by their example to act according to conscience rather than convenience. The historical questions surrounding the White Rose continue to generate scholarship. Researchers examine their tactics, analyze their philosophical influences, trace their connections to broader resistance networks. Archives yield new documents, letters, interrogation records, witness statements. Each discovery adds detail to the historical picture, though the essential narrative remains constant. A small group of students opposed totalitarian evil, accepted terrible risk, maintained integrity unto death. Modern Germany has embraced the White Rose as foundational to national identity. Post-war German democracy defines itself partly through remembrance of resistance. The White Rose demonstrates that Germans themselves opposed Hitler, that Nazi ideology was not universally accepted, that moral courage existed alongside collective failure. This complex historical memory, acknowledging both guilt and resistance, characterizes mature democratic culture. The university where Sophie and Hans distributed their final leaflets has become a center for White Rose research and commemoration. The Ludwig Maximilian University maintains extensive archives, hosts annual memorial lectures, coordinates educational programs. Students walking through Geschwister-Scholl-Platz encounter the history daily, reminded that their predecessors died for principles. This institutional memory shapes campus culture, encouraging critical thinking and civic engagement. Yet commemoration also raises difficult questions. Some critics argue that Germany's focus on the White Rose serves to deflect from more uncomfortable truths about widespread complicity. The White Rose was exceptional precisely because so few Germans resisted. Millions participated enthusiastically in Nazi crimes. Millions more acquiesced through silence. Celebrating the few who resisted might allow the many to avoid reckoning with their own families' roles. These critiques have merit but miss essential points. Remembering resistance does not require forgetting complicity. The White Rose legacy works precisely because it highlights how rare courage was, how dangerous resistance became, how totalitarian systems make moral choice costly. Sophie Scholl's story reminds us that knowing what is right does not automatically enable action, that structural evil requires more than individual virtue to overcome. The letters Sophie wrote in her final hours provide perhaps the most intimate window into her character. To her family she wrote, "I ask you not to forget that there are many other parents who will have to mourn the deaths of their children." Even facing death, she thought of others suffering. To friends, she affirmed, "What we did will cause waves." She believed their witness would matter, that moral action retained meaning even in defeat. These letters reveal no fanatic, no ideologue, no person detached from human connection. Sophie loved her family, mourned the pain her choices would cause them, hoped for their understanding. She was afraid of death, but more afraid of living complicit in evil. She wanted to survive, but not at the cost of conscience. Her humanity makes her courage more remarkable, not less. She acted despite fear, not without it. The White Rose's tactics merit examination. They possessed no weapons, no military training, no organizational infrastructure. Their resistance consisted entirely of words, leaflets, painted slogans, moral arguments. By conventional measures, they failed. They did not overthrow the regime, did not stop the war, did not prevent atrocities. They distributed perhaps 10,000 leaflets, reaching a tiny fraction of Germany's population before being caught and executed. Yet assessing resistance solely by immediate outcomes misses its deeper significance. Moral witness has value independent of efficacy. Maintaining integrity under circumstances that punish integrity demonstrates human capacity for goodness, even when evil appears omnipotent. The White Rose showed that totalitarian control was never complete, that conscience could not be entirely suppressed, that truth retained power even when speaking it meant death. Sophie Scholl's final statement in court captured this understanding. When Freisler demanded to know what she hoped to accomplish, Sophie replied calmly, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start." She did not claim her actions would succeed by conventional measures. She knew she would die, knew the Reich would not fall because of student leaflets. But she believed beginning mattered, that first steps enabled later steps, that someone must speak when everyone else remained silent. History proved her correct. The White Rose did not survive to see Nazi Germany's defeat, but their witness contributed to it. Allied psychological warfare used their leaflets. Resistance networks drew inspiration from their courage. Post-war Germany built democratic identity partly on their memory. The waves Sophie predicted took decades to form, but they grew in power and reach. The contemporary relevance of the White Rose extends beyond historical memory. In an era of renewed authoritarian movements, of sophisticated propaganda, of pressure to conform to unjust systems, Sophie Scholl's example remains instructive. She demonstrates that resistance begins with individual choice, that moral courage does not require special training or heroic personality, that ordinary people can take extraordinary stands. The White Rose also teaches sobering lessons about resistance's costs. Sophie knew distribution of leaflets meant probable death. She proceeded anyway. This was not youthful naivety, but mature moral decision. She weighed risks, understood consequences, chose principle over survival. Such choices should not be romanticized or expected of everyone, yet they remain possible, even necessary, when alternatives mean complicity in profound evil. Today, visitors to Munich can walk the path Sophie and Hans walked on February 18, 1943. They can enter the university building, climb the stairs to the upper atrium, stand where Sophie scattered leaflets into the air below. They can see the plaques, read the names, contemplate the courage these young people showed. The physical locations remain, grounding abstract history in concrete places. Sophie Scholl died at 21 years old, her potential unfulfilled, her life barely begun. Yet her brief existence achieved what many longer lives do not: moral clarity in an age of confusion, courage in a time of fear, witness in the face of annihilation. She demonstrated that under the worst circumstances, human beings retain capacity for goodness, that truth maintains power even when violently suppressed, that one person's moral stand can echo across generations. The final image, Sophie Scholl standing beneath the guillotine blade, speaking words of faith as guards prepared to end her life, embodies the White Rose legacy. Facing absolute power, she maintained absolute integrity. Confronting death, she affirmed life's highest meanings. Condemned by a criminal regime, she stood justified by conscience and by history. Such a fine, sunny day, and she had to go. But her going became her greatest act of witness, her death the seed of her immortal influence. The White Rose, crushed in 1943, blooms still in memory and in continuing inspiration. Sophie Scholl lives wherever courage confronts tyranny, wherever conscience speaks against injustice, wherever individuals choose moral truth over temporal power.